Folks, if you watch this podcast, then you know that the story of this remarkable island fascinates me. And I believe that the study of this place can tell us most of what we need to know about who we are and where we're going or should be going as a society and as a nation. And as I've said before, the characters define the history. And as one gets to know this history a bit, those main characters become fairly clearly defined. In the 17th century, names like Hudson, Block, Minuit, and Stuyvesant blazed the trail. In the 18th century, Franklin, Payne, Hamilton, and Washington take over the landscape. And as we progress into the 19th century, names like Morgan and Roosevelt stand out not just for their titanic personas, but also for the historic and lasting impact they would have upon this incredible place that we now call New York, not to mention upon the wider world altogether. And in fact, it was these very two characters themselves who led me to today's guest, a man who not only, it seems, shares my fascination with this swath of history, but a man who understands with profound expertise that character drives any story. And whether we consider a story fiction or nonfiction, I would estimate that my guest also understands, as well as anyone, that what we refer to as fiction is seldom purely that. And that the best fiction, in my humble opinion anyway, is almost always formulated on historical facts. And when those facts pertain directly to our lost American history, I am in, my friend. I am most certainly in. And whether real or imagined, this book provides an astonishingly vivid illustration of life on the oppressive Manhattan streets in August of 1896, an election year when a 38-year-old ancestral Manhattanite named Teddy Roosevelt plays a pivotal role. Yet that role is not actually as one of the presidential candidates. No, not in 1896 anyway, because at that time, Teddy Roosevelt was actually our fiercely committed New York City police commissioner, whom we follow through a series of dubious encounters with the most powerful man in America. Also, not one of the candidates, but rather J.P. Morgan, the actual man behind the iconic name, who, as our guest will tell us, was more influential than the president himself. And for whatever fiction is woven into this novel, I would venture to estimate that it is solidly counterbalanced with pertinent and compelling historical fact. But rather than speculate on whatever that balance may actually be, we're going to go right to the source and hear all about it directly from this prolific writer himself. The book is Hottime, a mystery novel that takes place on the island of Manhattan in the sweltering summer of 1896, and we are exceedingly privileged to be able to introduce the brilliant creator of this fascinating tale right now, who goes by W.H. Flint, but he is also known as author, historian, scholar, and professor Gerard Helferich, whom we warmly welcome to the program now. Welcome, Mynheer.
Very much, Chance, for that nice introduction. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. I am, as I said to you just before, I'm very, very excited to talk to you. You've written about a couple of my favorite characters now, both in nonfiction form and in fiction form. And I think that's really interesting. Can you tell me about going between those two genres and how you go about doing that?
I started as a nonfiction author. I published 5 nonfiction books, and one of them was called Theodore Roosevelt and the Assassin. It was about an assassination attempt on Roosevelt when he was running for third term as president in 1912. And one of the side characters in that book, really as a financier of one of the financiers of the Republican campaign, was J.P. Morgan. But he only played a cameo role in that book. But I became interested with Morgan and Morgan as well as Roosevelt. And so my next book was called An Unlikely Trust, where I decided to explore the relationship between Roosevelt and Morgan. They're usually portrayed as the as diametrically opposed forces in American history, the great trust buster Roosevelt and the great trust builder Morgan. And the more I read about them, the more I realized that that was only part of the story. That in fact, they had a lot of things in common. They were the same social class. In some ways, they were temperamentally similar. They both were Victorian moralists at heart, for instance. They both had a love for order. And I realized that, and as I say, the more I read about it, that there are some ways that the two of them actually worked together during the course of Roosevelt's presidency to save the country from disaster, not once, but several times, such as the financial crash in 1907 and the great anthracite coal strike in 1902. And those are problems that would not have been solved without the cooperation of Roosevelt and Morgan. But as I wrote about them as nonfiction characters, I was frustrated sometimes by the lack of sources, because you can't make it up in nonfiction. You have to have the source there, or you don't know what the characters were saying. And all my nonfiction books had a strong narrative element, in times almost novelistic element. But there were some scenes where I just could not portray the way I wanted to because of the lack of source material. So I decided that for Hottime, for my next book, which turned out to be Hottime, I would throw aside the nonfiction mantle that I've been carrying for almost 20 years since I started writing books. And I would indulge my creativity more and my it's a fun, really.
Yeah, I mean, it really must afford you an incredible freedom and liberation in a way, because first off, I'm going through every detail in the book. And I'm saying that's probably true, and I'm like, that's probably true, and there's probably a lot of truth to that. So you're not just making stuff up. I mean, you are a historian and a scholar, aside from being an author. So when you're approaching writing a novel about this swath of history, it's very clear that there's a lot of very, very pertinent facts woven into your story.
Let me just clarify that I'm not a trained historian. I really consider myself a writer, and I've never started a book knowing a lot about the subject I was writing about. One of the great pleasures in me in writing is the chance to do research. And that was very much learning about a time, for instance, and then being able to convey that knowledge with readers. And that was very much something I wanted to maintain, even in writing fiction. So I have an afterword at the author's note at the end of the book that explains what I've made up and what I've created. But I went through great pains to stay as strictly as close to the truth as possible. All the main characters in the book were real people. For instance, the weather, every temperature that I give, every drop of rainfall that I mention is from the historical record. I went to great lengths to get the geography in Manhattan correct, and description of buildings and where a horse car line was. Oh no, was that a trolley line or was that a horse car line? And for me, I guess you could say that was because of my rooting in nonfiction, but it was also, I found that part of the inspiration for me. I was trying to create, in this book, I was trying to create a world that no longer exists, as I tried to do in the nonfiction books. But here I felt I could create it more fully because I could dramatize things, for instance, that I couldn't dramatize in the other books. But again, with this idea that it was all very much rooted in fact.
You definitely took me away, and for somebody who's really into this swath of history, it was really exciting and just it was an escape, a really cool escape, and an indulgent escape in many ways. And I think that for a lot of people, that adventure, that element of it is what, I mean, when someone watches a show like Game of Thrones, that's essentially what's happening. They're being taken to another place that's unfamiliar and cool and scary and exciting. And to me, that's partially what you're doing in doing this type of writing.
That's certainly what I wanted to do. Not only create believable characters, but create a world that really, I mean, the reason I wrote the book primarily was that I wanted to experience this world myself. I wanted to go back to 1896 New York and be able to smell what the street smelled like, and to hear the noises that you heard on the street, and to eat the foods that people ate, and then having done that, I wanted to be able to share that with readers.
The entire history of the island of Manhattan, I think, is, as I said, I think in many ways it's our lost American history. I think people don't understand how pivotal the events and issues that occurred on and around Manhattan became in our overall society today and who we are. And just this, like the 1907 stuff that happened on 36th Street in J.P. Morgan's library, which you really get into in The Unlikely Trust, which is just incredible book as well. And I know we're talking mostly about this one today, but they're both incredible. And I think that the characters are not, I think there's something really noble when an author can bring these characters to life and give them that life, get them off the dusty pages and really give them life. And the way you showed these scenes where J.P. Morgan calls Teddy Roosevelt over in the Union League Club, and Teddy Roosevelt's the police commissioner, but he's got no choice. He has to go. He has to go over.
Well, Roosevelt and Morgan, of course, were huge figures, not just in New York history, but American history. And they really helped me. They couldn't have been more cooperative as characters, as subjects, because they're both such larger-than-life figures that it was really a lot of fun to imagine what that conversation you mentioned, Union Legal, might have sounded like. For instance, the way the book, just to give a little background on the book, it's 1896. New York is experiencing one of the greatest heat waves in its history that before it's over, 10 days later, will kill somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 people in New York City alone. And against that background, J.P. Morgan is being blackmailed by a publisher named William Dalton Mann. Dalton Mann was also a real figure. He was a publisher, and he was actually blackmailing J.P. Morgan, along with a lot of other prominent people in New York City. So Morgan, this is a presidential election year. Morgan is heavily involved financing presidential election on the Republican side. And the Republicans and Morgan cannot afford the scandal that William Dalton Mann is threatening to expose to be made public. So Morgan calls Roosevelt over, the most powerful man in America, calling Roosevelt over. And he was a longtime friend of the family. He was a friend of Roosevelt's father. So they knew each other since Roosevelt was a boy. Morgan was somewhat old. And he calls him over and he asks Roosevelt to intervene to see what he can do. He wants him to bring Dalton in and have a talk with him in the office of the police commissioner and to threaten him, make him stop blackmailing Morgan. Roosevelt replies the next day. And that night, William Dalton Mann turns up dead under the Brooklyn Bridge. So that's the beginning of the story. The hero is a fellow named Otto Raphael, who is another real character. He was one of the first Jews hired on the New York police force. He's recruited personally by Roosevelt. And in the book, he becomes Roosevelt's assistant. In real life, he was just a patrolman. But Rafe, as I call him, decides that he is going to investigate this murder. The murder is officially classified as a robbery. But when Rafe starts to snoop into a little bit, partially out of idealism and partially out of ambition, he realizes that couldn't possibly be the case. So he starts looking into it himself against Roosevelt's wishes, thereby threatening his own new career, which is really just starting. And the more he gets into the story, the more he convinced he is that there's something fishy going on and that it may lead all the way up to the highest ranks of the Republican Party. But it all starts with J.P. Morgan calling Roosevelt to his table.
Yeah, Rafe is a great character too, and you do a great job of illustrating that mosaic of ethnicities in New York, and definitely in that era. And it was very interesting. He was one of the first Jews on the force, and also the working with the lady whose last name I share. I forget Millie, I think, Kelly, and she was working in Roosevelt's office as well.
That's right. Another real person. Minnie Gertrude Kelly was her name. She was a celebrity in her own time. She was written up in the newspapers when Roosevelt hired her. She replaced two male stenographers, and she became the first woman in the history of the New York Police Department to work in any capacity other than a chambermaid or a cleaning lady or a prisoner's matron. And in the book, she and Rafe, she serves as Rafe's sidekick and also as his romantic in the book. But going back to Rafe's ethnicity, so of course New York was a great ethnic cauldron at that point. They're both first generation Americans. Her mother's from Ireland, Rafe's family is from Poland. In fact, Rafe himself was born in Poland. He came to the United States as a child. But Rafe has an attitude that's different from his father's. Rafe wants to assimilate. He speaks Yiddish, but he won't speak it. When they speak at home, his father speaks to him, he answers in English. And one of the sources of conflict in the beginning of the book is that Rafe's father doesn't want him working in the police department among all the Irish. He's warning him that the Irish don't want him. This isn't going to turn out well. And he wants Rafe to resume his job working in the family butcher shop, which is down Art. So one of the themes running throughout the book is the idea of immigration, and how immigrants assimilate or are welcomed, or particularly in the case of this particular book, not welcomed in the United States. And another theme is the discrepancy of wealth at that time. In a lot of ways, the Gilded Age was like today, where people were concerned about a growing wealth gap between the rich and the poor. And we see that where Rafe is living in the Lower East Side. His family is scrimping by his sons. And that night, or one night, he will go to the Union Roosevelt and see how that sphere of society moves. So the ideas of ethnicity and immigration and opportunity are all sort of interwoven themes.
Yeah, and you do a great job of that. The other thing that occurred to me in reading your book, well, both of your books so far, is that I think you may agree with me that when I want to examine an era of history, what I've come to realize is this, certainly in American history and certainly in this history of New York, if we look at three main sectors, being politics or government, politics, finance, and media, you can learn almost everything you need to know about what was going on. And you sort of do that in Hottime because you're talking about town topics. You're also talking about The Sun, which was Charles Dana's paper, which Jacob Riis is in your book. He's a character, and he was writing for The Sun. I think you also talk about Pulitzer.
I mentioned Pulitzer.
You mentioned Pulitzer a few times. That media story unto itself is its own story line entirely. But that weaves into this overall story in many, many ways, and who liked which paper and which was the Tammany Hall paper, which was the Republican paper, and it all kind of ties in.
You'll notice that Rafe, his father, and Roosevelt all read different newspapers.
Right.
Because of their own politics and their own case. But the idea of media newspapers also brings up another main character in the book, who is a fictional character. His name is Dutch. He's a 10-year-old newsboy, homeless newsboy, who he gets drawn into the murder because he's seen something while he's sleeping in an alley during this heat wave that he wasn't supposed to see, and it threatens his life, and it ends up turning the plot of the book, ends up largely turning on the fact that Dutch saw this. So again, you have the idea of how the media was sold, how newspapers were sold at that time. There were approximately 15,000 homeless children living in New York City in the 1890s. And Dutch and his fictional friend and sidekick, Grady, were two of them. So even though they weren't real people, they're intended to represent, again, this idea of wealth, difference in wealth, and also how people like Pulitzer and Dana built their newspaper empires, which were basically on the back of homeless children.
I had mentioned my uncle, my great uncle is John Kelly. He was a newsboy for James Gordon Bennett Sr. when he was about 12 years old when he had to go to work.
My next book is a sequel to Hottime that I finished. The book after that is actually involves the one I just started working on now. Involves Tammany Hall. I think it's going to. I'm just starting it, but I think it's going to involve Tammany Hall. It takes place in 1900 when Roosevelt is running for vice president.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Well, this sort of picks up right after this.
Then. In the second book, he's governor of New York, and in the third book, he is running.
Yeah, he wasn't governor very long, was he? It was only 2 years.
Yes, he did. He completed his term in January after he was elected vice president, and then he, of course, was sworn in as vice president in March. So he had a meteoric rise.
It was pretty meteoric, wasn't it? And he went to war after he was police commissioner when he was 39 years old.
That's right. He was forced out, really, police commissioner. He was on the verge of losing his job. He didn't make a lot of friends as police commissioner. He was a really energetic reformer. He threw out a lot of bad cops. For instance, he introduced merit exams for promotions and for hiring. He took away the department's largest source of graft. The department was bringing in more before Roosevelt's time in graft than it was in its official city budget. And Roosevelt took that away by enforcing the Sunday saloon closing laws. So that didn't endear him to a lot of people. And closing down the saloons didn't endear him to a lot of Democrats either, a lot of the immigrants. So Roosevelt didn't have many friends in New York. In fact, in the first chapter, when Roosevelt and Morgan meet at the Union Beat Club, Morgan thanks him, says, "Thanks to you, I'm no longer the most reviled man in New York City." So he was on the verge of losing his job, and he fled to Washington, took a couple of jobs in Washington, first as commissioner of the civil service, and then he was appointed undersecretary of the Navy, and resigned there to become colonel of the Rough Riders. And he returned to the States after the short war, successful war in Cuba, a national hero. And the Republicans, who were thinking that they didn't have a chance to win the governorship of New York in 1898, recognized that Roosevelt was a true hero and on his way to becoming the most popular person in the world, was their candidate with a lot of promise. So they nominated vice president, and of course, less than a year after that, when McKinley was assassinated, he became president.
The two of them together, again, an Unlikely Trust, your nonfiction book about these two, and Hottime are both incredible because they profile the relationship between these two. They're really amazing characters. Is there anybody today who you can compare either one of these two to?
I don't think so. I think that they're both unique, and I don't think they will ever be replicated. Roosevelt, just look at Roosevelt for a second. He's such a fascinating character. He's a great character to write about, whether in fiction or nonfiction. He is hugely intelligent. He is a dynamo. He's known for never sitting still. He wrote 40 books. Besides his political career, he wrote 40 books. He was a real progressive, trying to help. He was really dedicated to helping people less well off than himself. So that's sort of the part of the positive side. Of course, he's a tremendous conservationist. He changed the federal government and the office of the presidency forever by assuming more power. But on the negative side, he was not immune to the dark side of his time either. He was a racist. He thought that the white race was superior. He was kinder than many whites at the time, toward people of color. And he was criticized for that. But there's no getting away from the fact that he had his blind spots. Things like racism, imperialism, militarism. But part of that's what makes him maybe not a perfect person, but it makes him a fascinating character because he is such an anomaly. He's such a contradiction, self-contradiction in a way. And Morgan is the same way. Morgan is often portrayed as a robber baron, but he wasn't. He wasn't a Carnegie. He wasn't a Rockefeller. If Morgan had wanted to, he could have died with many more millions than he did. But Morgan was a very principled person. He was like Roosevelt, as I say. He could commit millions on his say-so verbally, and people would accept it because they knew that he was absolutely above reproach. And his power over Wall Street lay in the fact that he was above reproach. Everyone trusted him. Everyone looked up to him. So, so they were both unique. And after Morgan, no one else was that could. By the time Morgan died, the American economy had gotten so much larger, largely because of Morgan's own efforts.
Right.
Financing companies like U.S. Steel and AT&T, for instance, that Morgan had made himself obsolete by the time he died. So in the world of business, there could never be another Morgan because things had changed so much.
Was J.P. Morgan our de facto Federal Reserve before there was a Federal Reserve?
He absolutely, more than once, Morgan stepped in and personally saved the United States government from default. One of the times that he did that was in 1902 when he resolved this crisis, 1907, the banking crisis. But he could, again, because of his stature, he could bring bankers together in a way that no one else could. So that if the government or if there needs to be bailed out, if there was a run on the banks that was threatening the basis of the economy, which is what happened in 1907, Morgan could put together a consortium, tens of millions of dollars, and bail it out. And in fact, it was the banking crisis in 1907 that ultimately led to the creation of the Fed, because that was during the presidency of Wilson at that point. But during 1907, there was no one else to act. The federal government couldn't save the American. It didn't have the tools to save the American economy. Private bankers had to step in, and it was one of the few countries in the world that didn't have a system. So it was so in 1913 that act was passed by Congress and the Federal Reserve was formed.
And I love the way you laid it out in Unlikely Trust about those events, in detail, the course of events that took place during the Panic of 1907, and that most of it took place at his library right there on 36th Street, where I've taken to lingering outside that building now, almost like a stalker. I'm so into this story. Just talk about that a little bit, because you go into great detail in the book about that.
That was a case where I was lucky because there were tremendous sources available. People who were involved wrote about it. People who were involved were interviewed. There was a lot of material to draw from, and it was actually easy and fun to create the dramatic scene that saved that crisis. Morgan brought bankers together and literally locked them into his library adjoining his house. And he refused to let them leave until they would each commit a certain number of millions, and he had the money he needed to save the banking industry. I don't remember the exact figures, 30 million or 35 million, something like that.
I think it was, what he did was, he said he would put up 25 million to save the trusts, but he mandated that the bigger trusts had to put up another 25 amongst themselves to fortify the smaller trusts.
That's right.
Right? That's in your book. I learned that from you.
And it was a very dramatic time because the fate of the U.S. banking system, the U.S. economy was hanging in the balance, and it was all settled in this very dramatic, almost melodramatic scene. All these bankers being called together by J.P. Morgan, and he called them one by one up to his desk and had them sign with his pen that they would donate certain millions of money until he had what he needed.
And there you go. The most powerful man in America. He was, truly. So after being a career writer of articles and nonfiction, as well as doing a lot of editing work, and now having published your first novel, where does your appetite veer for future projects?
I have to tell you, fiction was a lot of fun. And I wouldn't say that I would never write a nonfiction book again, but at the moment, I have this, as I say, I've just finished the second novel, which is with publishers now. Hopefully someone will be interested. And I've just started a third. So for the foreseeable future, probably the next couple of years, the bulk of my efforts are going to be fiction. Beyond that, I don't know.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, it seems like after going into fiction, going back to nonfiction would bring on all sorts of restrictions that you wouldn't necessarily welcome at that point.
I think that's true. Once you get used to the freedom.
Yeah.
After I did an Unlikely Trust, I put some time into thinking what I wanted to do next. And I decided that the three most important things to me as a writer were the opportunity to do research and learn, and the opportunity to tell a story, and the opportunity to be able to play with the language, to be able to indulge some stylistic elements. And that's when I realized that I really wanted to turn to fiction, because I could keep the first two. I could do the research, I could tell a story, certainly, with fiction, but I would also have a little more latitude to insert my voice into the story.
Well, I got to say, sir, I think you're approaching it from a great angle, and you're doing a magnificent job of it. So I do encourage you. I'm going to read whatever you write. I'm a fan. So, but I definitely see the fiction making a lot of sense as well. So I encourage you to do that as well.
I very appreciate it. But I think that every writer could use all the encouragement.
Now, tell me this. I've been meaning to ask you, a guy who lives in Mississippi and New Mexico knows a heck of a lot about New York. What's up with that?
Well, I'm a native upstate New York.
Okay, where from?
Troy.
Oh, Troy, that's right. I think I read that. My son went to RPI briefly. Yeah.
Characters in my second novel headed RPI.
Well, there's a huge amount of history up there, and Albany is, I think, the second oldest city, so to speak, in the country anyway. So there's all sorts of, our story goes up there as well, of course.
That's true, along with Henry Hudson, I guess. But I also worked in Manhattan for 25 years. I worked for publishing companies in New York. So writing about New York, of course, the city has changed in the last 100 some odd years, but I was pretty familiar with the basic geography of the city from having lived there. I ended up in Mississippi because my wife is from Mississippi. And after we left publishing and decided to turn to writing, we lived in not New Mexico, but Old Mexico for a time. And then we came back to Mississippi 11 years ago. We came back.
So Mississippi is where you make your home?
Our home is in Mississippi
today. Great. Also, I haven't been there, but I like the South, what I've seen of it. So. Well, Mr. Gerard Helferich, I have great respect for anyone who makes a living with his written word, and for someone who can make history come alive with those words. Well, as I've done my best to articulate here, I think that is not only worthy, but a truly noble cause. I am very happy to find historians and authors. I know you don't categorize yourself as a historian, but I do, who share a bit of my fascination with this specific swath of history, the history of Manhattan Island. And for all those reasons, I say to you once again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on with us here and discuss your novel and all the incredible work that you do. And we look forward to following your career, and we wish you all the best with it every step of the way, sir.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Okay, Gerard. Thank you so much for being here. The book is Hottime by W.H. Flint, a sweltering novel that takes place on the sweltering streets of Manhattan in 1896. You can get it, of course, at Amazon and on Gerard's website, and we will provide all those links in the posts. Damas and Aaron, thank you so much for continuing this voyage of discovery en route to saying, wow, history's cool. We'll see you next time. Island and Island Voices are available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Links to both are also available on the homepage of our website, thepodcastisland.com. Island Voices is a production of Chance Kelly, Inc. and may not be reproduced or re-exhibited in any manner in whole or in part without authorization. Thank you.